Maverick News. The world is watching.
And, I want to take you even further back in history. What we just saw, and I apologize, some of this footage is pretty disturbing, these historical films that we're looking at tonight on the show. I would not subject you to this if I didn't feel that the history was important to revisit right now, because there are a lot of people out there who either forgot, they say never forget, but obviously a lot of people forgot this history, or they just didn't know it in the first place. Some people out there in our audience are seeing these shocking films for the first time tonight, right here on Strange Bedfellows. So I did want to give you guys a trigger alert. I'm sorry, I should have warned you before I played that last clip. And I'm going to take you back 20 years prior to World War II and what happened during the Russian Civil War. Again, this same region, what we call Galicia, which was then Poland, and the pogroms that occurred in those years.
We will return to Germany and to the rise to power of Adolf Hitler and Nazism later. Let's now go back to the latter days of the First World War and to the collapse of the Russian Empire. As we have already mentioned, a major event that occurred during this time was the Russian Revolution, which took place in two stages in late 1917. The revolution would prove to be a defining watershed for the 20th century, ending hundreds of years of Tsarist power and inaugurating nearly 3/4 of a century of communist rule. Throughout the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, feelings of dissatisfaction festered among the Russian Empire's population. Rampant governmental corruption, immense poverty, and persisting industrial, social, and economic backwardness all led to a general sense of disillusionment. As a response, numerous discontented groups and parties were formed. One such group were the Bolsheviks, a Marxist revolutionary faction that split from the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party in 1903. The Bolsheviks placed an emphasis on the working class and called for the violent overthrow of capitalism, as well as the formation of a Marxist dictatorship that would accelerate the transition to socialism. The party became increasingly popular among the urban workers and following the First World War, also among soldiers. Following a revolution in February 1917, Julian calendar, which overthrew the Tsar and established a provisional government, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized control of the government in October of that year, Julian calendar, refusing to share power with the other revolutionary groups. The new leaders quickly withdrew from the war and, following what they saw as Marxist communism, worked to nationalize private industry and agriculture in the name of the people. Following this coup, the former Russian Empire was plunged into the chaos of a brutal civil war as several forces sought to consolidate control over its various territories, vying to determine Russia's political future. Both the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War had far-reaching effects on the landscape of the region, causing radical social and political change and bringing about extreme violence. These did not spare the Jews of the former empire, who found themselves becoming equal citizens in the newly formed societal and political structure, but also targets of vicious pogroms.
These pogroms take place in the extraordinary chaos that erupts after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, when you have the Red Army, led by Leon Trotsky, that is fighting against the white forces, who want to reinstate the Tsar, want to return to autocracy, and they're fighting on behalf of the abdicated Tsar. And you have the Ukrainian forces, led by Semyon Petliura, who do not want to be under the Soviets, do not want to be under the whites, but they want an independent Ukraine. And then you have a number of peasant insurgent groups who want the land, who want land and who are suffering because of the economic crisis that was triggered by World War I. So in this extraordinary chaos, you have an eruption of anti-Jewish violence that has not been seen before. 200,000 Jews are killed. 300,000 Jewish children are left as orphans. According to some new studies, 1/3 of Jewish women are raped in public, whereby rape is being used as an instrument of ethnic cleansing. I would even refer to these pogroms almost as a forgotten genocide, because some shtetl are completely wiped off the face of the earth. Now, why are these pogroms so important as far as the interaction between Jews and the state and Jews and non-Jews? Now, most Jews before the pogroms were critical of the Bolsheviks, were against the Bolsheviks. However, in the context of the extraordinary violence that we have in the Civil War, the extraordinary anti-Jewish violence, most Jews will choose the lesser of two evils. They will have to choose the Bolsheviks, because the Bolsheviks, the Red Army, is the only army that does not carry out systematic anti-Jewish violence in the areas of Ukraine and Belarus, whereas the other armies, the other insurgent groups do carry out this kind of violence that is very systematic, also thanks to the fact that it is carried out in a militarized fashion, unlike pogroms before. Of the 1880s, 1903, 1905, the pogroms of the Civil War are carried out in a militarized fashion, especially by the white movement.
Wow. And you know, something that's really important to point out, I was kind of getting to it earlier, how this was politically motivated. It wasn't really motivated by, bias towards their religion. There was a racial component, but it was primarily political. It was the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, that had Germany and Poland and the West so incredibly concerned. And that's why Russia was invaded by 20 different countries after World War I and the revolution. Kevin, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a lot of what was said in that clip you played is true. But again, they kind of slant it as anti-Soviet Union again. You're getting me the chance to talk about what I was supposed to talk about on my show this morning.
Until technical difficulties intervened.
Till many technical difficulties, yeah.
Darn, I was so looking forward to that too.
Yeah. So, they talked about the Jews had to pick the lesser of the evils, and there were groups that were, carrying out pogroms against the Jews. Reality is the Bolsheviks were not. A lot of the history people don't understand. Vladimir Lenin was himself a quarter Jew. So, it doesn't make sense that the leader of the Bolsheviks, was carrying out mass murders against Jews.
And, I've read a lot of oral histories from that period from the people who survived the pogroms, and they all say time after time, I've seen these stories repeated, how they talked about the whites, or what would become the Ukrainian nationalists, would come riding into their village, burn it down, take everybody out and shoot them, rape the women, kill the kids. It was horrific. And every time it was the Red Army who came riding into town and took care of it, put down the pogrom, nursed the wounded, buried the dead, ran those bandits out of town. And they did this in village after village after village from 1919 through 1921. It was just a constant thing that Lenin and Stalin and the Bolsheviks had to deal with, was putting down pogrom after pogrom after pogrom. And they say that the Red Army were their heroes. They came in and saved the day, and then they did it again in World War II. They were the ones who liberated most of the concentration camps.
Well, Stalin's third wife was Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
Trotsky, his actual name was Bronstein. So if that tells you anything, and of course they talked about him in that clip. A majority of the leaders in even the times of the Tsars were Jewish or had Jewish wives. So it isn't something that really is, a big problem here. Do we have anti-Semitism? Absolutely. Everybody has it to some extent. But I don't know. What can I let me do this. I read a thing from the Chechens. We're hearing right now about the Muslim population of Russia, all up in arms about the Israelis and refugees. And I read something for Rick from the Chechens that said, these people have fought with us for ages. They live amongst us. The Jews fight with us in the special military operation. Today in Russia is National Unity Day, hence my background here. And this was a statement by soldiers on the front lines in Ukraine. It says, "We come to congratulate everybody in our motherland on National Unity Day. Today, here Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Jews, fighters of all religions and nationalities are defending our land from the Nazis, so that the people of Russia can live calmly and safely, so that every child can grow up with pride in our country and with respect for everyone around the world. We are all equal here, and we are all for each other, and you be for each other and for us in a peaceful land." This is the general attitude of Russians. The first Jewish state was originally proposed for not only Crimea, but they called it Crimea and California. It was Crimea and that region going up through Kherson and Odessa all the way over to where Romania is. It was supposed to be that big area, which was proposed initially.
That's
and
right.
Stalin agreed to that in the mid to late 20s. And they had some, I don't remember the number, 75, 95,000 Jews move into the area.
Right.
But as what happened is they were funded by Jewish organizations in the United States, and the Soviet Union gave them money to relocate there and start communities. And the locals started complaining and rising up against them. And again, was it a pogrom? Maybe, I don't know. But the people were against these well-off Jews with lots of money settling in this entire region, and it was causing problems. So as what Stalin did in 27 is he actually created a Jewish region in, it's often said in Siberia, but it's actually out in the Far East. It's right on the border of China and Mongolia, right in the corner down there. It's not a wonderful place.
Well, he sent them to no man's land, but
he
at least
them to no man's
the pogroms
land.
would not find them there.
Exactly.
Right.
Because the people would leave them alone, is what I was told by Dmitry this morning, is In the summer, it is hot and humid, and in the winter, it is cold. So it sounds kind of like northern Florida to me. And there were, right now, there's about 75,000 people there. 10% of them are Jewish. Their population has been 10 to 11% all along. But this was the same time that we had the Balfour Memorandum that Britain proposed, along with, making promises to 20 other countries to get their way, with the intention of keeping none of them. And, we actually have a town not too far from us, about 30 kilometers away, 12, 14 miles from us. It's named Inkerman. And where do you think the name Inkerman came from? It's a Jewish city in Crimea. We have 3 synagogues here. And nobody bothers any of the Jews here. But, this is the territory that these well-off Jews wanted, and their wives. They wanted the warm, temperate climes, and instead they were given, BF Egypt.
Right.
So,
right. Not the prime real estate for sure out there.
Yeah.
But Crimea certainly is.
This was brought up again at the Yalta conference, and it was Roosevelt who he kind of led Stalin in this a little bit with some unfair statements. He said, "Stalin, I'm a Zionist. How about you?" And Stalin said, in principle, I am, but there's problems with this movement. And this is the reason why he supported that in Palestine. That and the
Soviet Union was like the first country to vote at the United Nations for the creation of Israel.
Yeah, and it's kind of like Rick said earlier. It was a political thing, though. They wanted a Jewish state in Palestine because they sent many Soviet military men, leaders there, Jewish leaders, to help arm them, to help train them, to, who were the guys that were the enemies of the Soviet Union at the time? The Arabs. So you plant a bunch of Russians, Jewish Russians, in the middle of Palestine, have them train a bunch of Jews, and you have what we have today.
And what's interesting is for several years, Stalin forbade his citizens to migrate to the new state of Israel. The Jews were not allowed to leave for several years. He wanted to keep them, I guess, in his mind, safe at home in the Soviet Union, and he felt that the Red Army could adequately protect them. He liked that idea of autonomous zones to protect them, and I understand the reasons why, because it's sort of like that planned migration, the planned original Jewish state or settlement in Crimea, for example. That movement started in the early to mid 20s, and the whole reason for it, if I understand it correctly, was to prevent the pogroms that were still a very recent memory of 1919, 20, and 21, and the threats against Jews specifically and communists, because there was this, I think of it as a mental illness that the Nazis had, that the Ukrainian nationalists had, where they conflated Bolshevism and Judaism. They called it Judeo-Bolshevism. And I know it's kind of a complex subject, so I have a short clip to show you here that kind of explains.
The Russian Revolution had additional implications on the way Jews were treated and perceived, both inside and outside of what would become the Soviet Union. Firstly, under the Bolsheviks, Jews were granted civil equality and anti-Semitism was outlawed. However, as we will soon see, the Bolshevik definition of Judaism and Jewishness would also greatly limit their religious and national freedom, affecting their treatment and the way others perceived them. An additional outcome of the revolution and the events following it was the growing fusion of Jews and revolutionary movements, especially Bolshevism. As discussed in last week's lesson, this perception already began to appear in the late 19th century. Following the Russian Revolution and its aftermath, it became even more widespread. Let's turn to examine these developments further.
The Bolshevik Revolution seemed to open up glorious new opportunities for some Jews, among many other peoples and classes, but it carried within it the seed of destruction for Jewish culture in areas of the former Russian Empire that fell under long-term communist control, because ultimately the communists defined Jewish identity in narrowly ethnic terms and were opposed to both traditional religious culture as well as to Hebrew and Zionist culture. And so only certain forms of Yiddish culture were initially cultivated and tolerated under Soviet rule, and eventually that too came to be extinguished in the 1950s. And even more catastrophic than the impact of communism on as the sort of pluralistic diversity of Jewish culture in the former Russian Empire was the linkage that developed between European anti-communism and anti-Semitism. Because to the extent that Jews were somewhat disproportionately represented in the ranks of communist movements, and initially in the Soviet Union and in other parts of Europe, and to the extent that Jews more broadly were disproportionately represented among movements of the left, including social democratic movements, and insofar as Marx had been of Jewish heritage, even if he was an anti-Semite himself, it was easy to put a Jewish face on communism. It was completely distorting and manipulative to do so, but it was an easy propagandist link for anti-communists and anti-Semites to make and to find common ground on. The Nazis exploited this ruthlessly. The myth of the Żydokomuna, of the Judeo-communist conspiracy, was a powerful political force in Poland in the 1930s and into the 1940s. And so this perception, however misleading and distorted, of communism as being some kind of aspect of a Jewish conspiracy against Christianity, private property, and European civilization, was to prove literally lethal for Jews in the context of rising anti-Semitism in interwar Europe, and then obviously in the context of the Holocaust, which I think would have it cannot be reduced to that element, but the linkages are striking.
As I've said, anti-Semitism today is this anti-Semitism is sort of a postmodernist political anti-Semitism. It's rooted in political motivations and anti-Semitic tropes that have roots in anti-Jewish prejudices and cliches that are sort of present within the history of even anti-Jewish Christian bigotry.
Yeah,
it extends, into every country. So it becomes kind of complex, and almost you can't explain it to some degree, but you can. And it manifests itself in strange ways, even here in Canada. So, Lori isn't going to want to see this. But you go to just here in Canada, sorry, Marxists, communists here in Canada, they're aligning, they're actually lining up with the fascists because they've bought into the anti-Semitic rhetoric, which has been cloaked in this new, I would call it let's call it woke fascism. Okay. And they're buying into it. So you go to the Marxist.ca website and you're finding all kinds of it there. Are you a communist on the top? But then it says, what can communists do to free Palestine? And then you read this release from them and you scroll down. I mean, it's I would say it's anti-Semitic. And then I did say on my program that this has woven its way into the freedom movement in Canada. And I've been listening to, it's very pro-communist rhetoric that is now flowing from this populist movement, which is part of the freedom movement. It's becoming very weird and it's anti-Semitic at the same time. And yes, I'm sorry, but there are people within, as we've seen, people within the freedom movement who want to overthrow our government. Now there are Marxists who want to overthrow our government. And Lori sent me a message and, friendly, but she said, communists don't want to overthrow your government. But then right in this release, it says right in here that, right here, above all, we need to overthrow our own imperialist government in Canada. I didn't make it up. It's right there. People's heads are exploding, man. It's like we are in so much trouble because everybody is just picking a side. And strangely, it seems it's just leading us down these paths to the same mistakes that we've made in the past. I understand it. It's hard to wrap your head around how can the fascists and the communists be lining up together against the Jews? It's right there, man.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Well,
it's the craziest goddamn thing I've ever seen, Rick. I have to tell you.
It is, but
I talked to my communist friends about it. And of course, the reason that they align themselves with Palestine, there's a number of reasons, but
oppressed versus the oppressor, they're automatically defaulting to the side of the victim.
And it's
in
an
their
alliance
minds.
that's been in
The
place
supposed victim.
since
Right,
the 50s.
supposed victims, yes.
Yeah. I mean, Stalin kind of switched sides in the 50s. They were in the Soviet Union after Stalin died, and started to align themselves with their former enemies.
I'm not giving Stalin a pass. He killed a lot of people, man. He killed a lot of people, and he killed his
a lot of
political
Nazis,
opponents.
that's for sure.
And it wasn't just. And one day he's recorded saying a lot of anti-Semitic things. The next day he's passing declarations to protect the Jews. He's all over the map because he's, like I said, as far as I'm concerned, he's just like a gangster politician who did whatever he had to do to further his political agenda, which was communism. And if he had to break a few omelets or a few eggs to make an omelet, he broke a lot of eggs. He broke a lot.
Well, you know what, Winston Churchill.
And it's all in the past anyway. But man,
you know what Winston Churchill said about Stalin. He said that Stalin was a mystery wrapped inside an enigma, wrapped inside a mystery or something like that.
Yeah.
And he was, because here's a man who saved the Jews of Europe, while at the same time, they say he himself was anti-Semitic, yet he had a Jewish wife.
But but on the one hand, he's like forming an alliance with Hitler, and he's saying, hey, let's carve up Europe. You come on in, you take half of Poland, and I'll take the other half. And to hell with the Jews over there. During that time, it wasn't until Hitler finally broke the agreement, which he expected he would at some point. It had been weakened by his war with the Allies, which was a strategic move. He didn't give a damn, right? It was like, do I get what I want? or we'll just carve it up. Just don't attack me. That's not saving the Jews. That's just doing what you think is in your best political interests at the time. I'm sorry. He was no saint, man.
Strange
So the
bedfellows, my friend.
Very
Strange
sure.
bedfellows.
That's right. Enemy
the
of my enemy
autonomous
is my friend.
republic
Yep.
actually wasn't meant to save the Jews. They were tinkerers. They were craftsmen. They were, sellers, marketers, and this went against the Soviet flow. So by moving them way off into BF Egypt over there in, the Far East, the goal was to get them to start farming. So that was that deal. Now, making the agreement with Hitler, that was done specifically because he knew that they were going to attack the Soviet Union. And it was a delay tactic so that they could prepare more.
Yep.
So I'll defend him on that point.
Mhm.
Did he make agreements with Hitler? Absolutely. It was to delay things, though. And yes, this goes into that whole, Jewish thing. Are you for the Jews? Are you against them? And it's a big political thing anyway, because, yes, he saved 8-9 million Jews from the Holocaust. But was his goal to save them? Or was his goal to save 22 million Soviets? They lost a lot more people than the Jews did.
That's
Yet
correct.
we make the big thing about, the
Mhm.
Holocaust was about the Jews.
Right.
Hey, a lot
Everyone
of Soviets
forgets
lost their
about
lives.
the 20 million other Soviets who lost their lives in that war.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
they were sent to concentration camps as well.
Yes.
So it's like you say, Rick, ultimately it's all governments and politics. You
Yep.
get to the people like us, and that's what matters.
Yeah. I agree with that. And, and it gets really complicated because you have a lot of Palestinians dying too, right? So, well, you have to protect the Palestinians. But what about the Jewish state? Well, if they pull the funding for military aid to Israel, well, then the anti-Jewish forces there will just roll right over Israel and exterminate them. And it can go the other way too. And we're witnessing that on the other side. So it's like, this is crazy on either side. You can't really win. They talk about Nuremberg 2.0 because of the pandemic and the crimes against humanity that way. Well, I'll tell you, I think there might be a Nuremberg 2.0 at the end of all this because of the war crimes we're seeing on all sides. All sides.
Mhm.
And you might have to, somebody, a third party, I don't know who, because it seems like everybody's going to be guilty at the end of this, but somebody should be dragging all these people in front of a trial at the end of this and holding them accountable for their war crimes. But who's going to do that when everybody's picking a side? Well, unfortunately, it seems like history repeating itself in this way too. The victor gets to write the history. That's a dangerous thing.
Absolutely.
And one last thing I wanted to touch on.
We grew up, the United States won World War II.
Of course we did. in Europe, huh? Well, if you fell asleep in history class, or depending on what they taught you in history class, that's the version of events that most Americans and Brits and probably Canadians believe is true. I just saw this report come across. This was just filed today, actually, by Voice of America. And oddly enough, it's about Galicia. We were just talking about the events of, the Ukrainian nationalists, the pogroms in that very land where all that occurred. This report just came across the wire, and I'm going to play it for you right now.
To all the members of the Drohobych, Borislav, Truskowitz communities.
The fall of 2019. This amateur footage captures a historic moment. David Avigdor, a rabbi from New Haven, Connecticut, enters the Choral Synagogue, a place of worship his grandfather, chief rabbi of Drohobych Yakov Avigdor, exited 80 years before.
It was an honor not only to the Avigdor family who survived the Holocaust, but to all those we remember today. 7 young Hasidim from Kiev in the U.S. accompanied Rabbi Avigdor during his visit.
Drohobych, a town in western Ukraine, was one of the Jewish centers of Galicia before World War II. Yaakov Avigdor held his final service here on Yom Kippur in September 1939, shortly after the start of the war. In recent years, Drohobych resident Leonid Goldberg has seen war up close both in Israel and Ukraine. He came under fire in 2019 when visiting his friends in southern Israel and had to hide in a mamad, a reinforced security room inside the apartment. In 2023, Russian rockets hit his hometown in Ukraine.
Children killed in Irpin, Bucha, Mariupol, and children killed in southern Israel. This is the new Nazism we face in the 21st century. Ukraine has been at war for 10 years. Israel has been repelling attacks since its founding. These two countries are now confronting global evil.
A local tour guide and publicist, Goldberg doesn't share Jewish roots with those who built the 158-year-old synagogue. His father hailed from Kharkiv and his mother from Donetsk. The family moved to Drohobych during Soviet times. Most native Drohobych Jews were killed during the Holocaust, and today Goldberg is doing what he can to preserve the region's unique historical heritage.
The last pre-war Jew of Drohobych died in 2015. It was Alfred Schreier, an outstanding musician and incredibly cultured man.
Маленька міщина, gdzie moja jedyna kochała mnie.
At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 3 Roman Catholic churches, 7 Orthodox churches, and 17 synagogues in Drohobych. Today there are no practicing rabbis here, but a lot of people caring for the tradition. This commitment has grown into an educational center.
In 2022, Yurkevich found himself defending Ukraine in the East. He remembers a friend from synagogue, helping however he could.
He always passes a lot of matzah to the front line. When vehicles with provisions couldn't reach us, the guys would come, and I'd distribute Jewish bread, as they call it. It helped a lot because matzah doesn't go bad.
The Choral Synagogue of Drohobych underwent a decade-long restoration funded by charity organizations and is now the largest synagogue in western Ukraine, operated by one of the smallest Jewish communities. The Star of David intertwined with the Ukrainian trident, a symbolic emblem depicted on Goldberg's kippah. He enters the doors of the city's synagogue every day, hoping all the wars in this world will forever remain beyond these walls. Mariano Shudlak for VOA News from Drohobych, Ukraine.
I'm sure you had some thoughts on that, Kevin. Go ahead.
Well, you know, the rabbi had it right. Ukraine's been at war for the last 10 years.
Yes.
So at least he's honest about that.
Is that the only honest thing you heard in that report?
You know, I'll say this. You know, we hear about the Ukrainian Nazis, and this is propaganda on the other side now. Yes, there are Nazis in Ukraine. You know, there's Nazis in the United States for that matter. The problem of Nazism in Ukraine isn't as big as the Russian press would make it out to be. Yes, they have it. It tends to be the Galicia end of Ukraine, you know, the Banderites. But in general, when we talk to our friends there isn't that big of an issue with Nazis in most of Ukraine. So, you know, again, it's propaganda. And this is what people need to understand is, you know, talk to people wherever you're, you know, considering what you're considering. And if you can't talk to people there, talk to people who can talk to people there. There's bad things going on by the Ukrainians against the Western Ukrainians. Absolutely, have been for years. Did Western Ukrainians take up arms against Eastern Ukrainians? Absolutely. Did Crimea vote to leave Ukraine? Yes. It isn't as clear of a picture as people tend to make it. It isn't a black and white thing.
It is
Never
extremely complex history. I've dug deep into it. It fascinates me. And yeah, I think that the history is important to remember, to understand. And we've tried our best to educate, to unravel that history, especially for people like us in the West who we just weren't taught this stuff in the United States. I don't know what they teach in Canada, but it's probably a lot like what we learned here. A lot of it depends on where you went to school, what you were taught. And looks like Rick has a video clip queued up there is that Stu Peters?
That's Stu Peters.
Oh, yay. Let's talk about Stu Peters.
Yeah.
This is his moment. This is a moment just made for a guy like Stu Peters.
Well, yeah, I mean, let me preface that with, we talked about the Nazi party in Canada that's sort of being formed with a Thunderbird nationalist party, right? And then this is their emblem, right? Which is a carbon copy, basically, of the emblem from Nazi Germany in World War II. But Kevin is quite right to point out that you really have to talk to the people, because in my neighborhood on the corner, there's a Palestinian, there's a Jewish guy who lives over there. I've got a Muslim friend 2 doors down, and we all get along. And there's really no issues in my neighborhood. We're all fine, right? But there are people trying to ramp everything up, and there are people with political motivations. That's what that guy promoting this new party in Canada is all about. But last night he's a First Nations guy, and it's an ethno-nationalist movement that is First Nations based for this new party. And yet last night, who did I have on the program? We had Carmel, who is a First Nations woman who was pushing back because she realized that he was basically tricking her, duping her and other people into following him with this new twisted sort of cloaked language and using new words that mean different things to tell, the age-old story of, how the world is being oppressed by Jews without actually using the word Jew, right? And we've been seeing this, especially over the last 3 years, with these anti-Semitic stories that are not being told using the word Jew. It's anti-Semitism without Jewish people in it, where it is, the world is being controlled by the elites who control banking, who control the pharmaceutical industry, who control the media. They're in complete control, and they're shadowy figures. You're never really quite sure who they are. And this story is being told by people like Stu Peters, who is now really coming right out and actually putting his anti-Semitism, his anti-Jewish feelings on full display for people, and receiving even media awards for doing it. And he's doing it alongside other influencers like Ye or Kanye West or whatever you want to call him.
Fuentes.
Yes, Nick Fuentes, people like that. And there are, others as well. And, here he is. And what does he want to do as a result? Where does this lead? Well, to this.
Yeah, that's weird. So we talked as we exited the last segment that we were going to start talking about what accountability looks like. Okay, because I want to go on the record again and just say the people that have perpetuated these crimes against humanity, when they're found guilty in a court of law, should be executed. They should be hanged or shot in the brain. These people should face.
They should definitely face the ultimate
extreme accountability.
Yeah.
And you see where it goes real quick. And and this is a guy who has a lot of followers, who's built a huge audience. And I'm sorry, folks, to tell you this, but a lot of what you've been hearing, and even some of this I didn't recognize it for a long time. But they're pulling people down into that rabbit hole, which is, it's been an indoctrination leading to this moment where they're now pivoting and taking the masks off and saying, look, you see, we had the answer all along. It's those people over there. And who are the Jews? Well, today it is Jewish people, but it's more than that. It's anybody they really point their finger at and say, it's that guy there, it's that doctor over there, it's this politician. And if they're not Jewish, then they're just the Gentiles. They're the pedophiles who are vulnerable to being exploited and controlled. They recruit those people and pay them off and say, we won't convict you if you do our bidding, and we'll put you into a position of power because we can control you because you're a pedophile or you're an adulterer or whatever other.
Or you were blackmailed by Jeffrey Epstein.
That's right.
Right? That's why you have to support Israel, because they've got the Mossad's got the dirt on you.
That's exactly right. Or Donald Trump, we've got him on the PP tape or, whatever it might be. Okay. And so that's how this story is being told, but it's all leading to the same place where it's always led. From the time of the death of Christ, where it was the Romans who killed Jesus, they executed him, but ultimately it became
the fault of the Jews. Yep.
Okay, so this goes back over time, and we need to be very careful about it because this really is history repeating itself again.
Oh, and it's even weirder this time because I've seen, Rick, and I won't name names, but I've seen several left-wing socialist accounts, even friends of mine, since this war started, retweeting the likes of Stu Peters, retweeting the likes of Nick Fuentes, and going, yeah, what he said, absolutely.
Yep.
And then you go, okay, now this is getting really weird because what a lot of people, my friends on the left, might not understand, and I would like my friends on the left and my communist friends to understand that Nazism and the worship and adulation of Adolf Hitler is still very much a thing in the Palestinian liberation movement of today. I'm going to show you something here that might just open your eyes. There is a line of clothing stores, I kid you not, in Gaza City, called Hitler. There's a Hitler 1 and a Hitler 2 because they're so popular. They've got 2 stores in the city of Gaza. Now, considering the bombing campaign and the airstrikes, I don't know if these stores are still standing right now or if they're open or closed or a pile of rubble, but it's a thing in Arab culture, and it's not just in Palestine, it's all throughout the Arab world. They call it Hitler chic, and a lot of the fashionable young men today are really into it. And I'm gonna show you the clothing store in Gaza. Take a look at this, guys. This is
اسم المحل هتلر، وانا بحبه يعني من كتر ما هو كان اكتر واحد معادي لليهود، لانه ظلمونا ويعني اخذوا حقنا، كل حقنا اخذوه في البلد، يعني ما خليناش اشي. يعني احنا الحين بس نروح نموت احسن، احنا عايشين من قلة الموت. وعجبني كمان يعني اللبس، هو احلى حاجة فيه اللبس، والاسم يعني تبعه روعة. لا مكشف.
أنا والله كنت شايف الإعلان هذا على الفيسبوك، أجيت حبيت أشوف المحل لأنه السكينة والكوفية والهذا صار رمز من رموز انتفاضة الأقصى، وحبيت يعني أجي على المحل وأشتري منه، عجبتني يعني الفكرة إنه قسم مساندة مع أهلنا بالقدس والضفة يعني وعجبتني يعني الفكرة كلها.
أنا مارق بدي أشتري أواعي، فلفت انتباهي المحل إنه بيعبر عن من رمز الانتفاضة في الضفة، ويعني هذه الشغلات مساندة لأهلنا في الضفة، قصة السكين والكوفية واللتمة، حاجات حلوة تلفت الانتباه، ويعني إشي حلو ومميز كمان، حاجات حلوة كتير.
From a few years back, I should tell you. You probably figured that out by now. And this is in no way to diminish the pain, the suffering of Gaza, of the innocent civilians in Gaza who've suffered these airstrikes now for 3 weeks, almost a month. It's
But
in no,
it
I'm
brings
I'm
up
in no way
questions for me,
minimizing
though.
that. Your question is?
It brings up questions for me.
Yeah.
We hear about the poor Palestinians who don't have jobs, only a very select few are allowed to go to Israel to work and earn money. Everybody else is dying. Who has the money to buy this stuff? And I'm going to couple that with something that Arkady told me a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Israel and Palestine. He said, Israelis go to Gaza City to buy stuff all the time. So who's buying this?
That's a good question. Are they locals or are they tourists? Maybe from Egypt or wealthier countries who are on a tour. Thought it was an interesting, I don't know if it's in a touristy area of the city, or again, if that place even still stands. And again, while I hate these airstrikes, I hate seeing the suffering of all these innocent people. Honestly, if they hit that store right there,
you'd be okay with it?
I'd be okay with that one store being destroyed. Yeah. And maybe its sister store, Hitler too. Give me a break. There's a lot more to be said. I could go much deeper on the history of that subject, but we'll save that for another time because we are, in fact, unfortunately, out of time. But man, this has been a really interesting conversation.
I want to remind people, he who forgets history is doomed to relive it.
Exactly.
So when people tell you history doesn't matter, it matters.
That's right. That's why this show was so important for me to do tonight.
And you've had, well, since you two are the strange ones, I must be the bedfellow.
Cute.
But Rick had, Bitcoin Bob. I kind of like Bitcoin Bob.
Did you?
But I think next week you need to have an Illuminati conspiracist on.
Oh,
we haven't heard from them in this whole deal.
Yeah, Rick knows a few of those guys. I'm sure he can find somebody.
Yeah, there you go.
Sometimes I watch Maverick News and I go, Rick, where do you find these people?
I wonder this all the time.
You? Where do you find these people, man?
They find me, guys. They find me.
I knew it. And see, we find each other. That's how we found Kevin Michelizzi. And I hope, folks, that if you're not already watching his channel, he has an excellent channel called American in Crimea, and also the InfoWars. Is it InfoWars Press? Is your other channel?
InfoWars Press, yeah.
Yeah, and they're all just part of the Maverick News Network. I hope you'll go subscribe to his channels. You'll see a lot of great stuff on there. He's done a whole series about the history of the Soviet Union that I think you'll love. But we are out of time. Folks, thank you so much for watching Strange Bedfellows, and we'll see you back here next Saturday night. Good night and peace.
In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
Yeah.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.